Very warm welcome to the new episode of Ink and Insights. This is your host Sumit Sarma Samir. This is a Nepal-based podcast, and if you are interested listening to the thought leaders and Nepali influencers from around the world, please subscribe to my channel. I'm extremely pleased to welcome Professor Jonathan White in my program today. Jonathan White is Professor of Politics and Deputy Head of the European Institute. He joined the LSE as a lecturer in September 2008 after completing his PhD at the European University Institute in Florence. He has held visiting positions at the Berlin Institute of Advanced Studies, Harvard, Stanford, the Humboldt University, Hertie School and Sciences Po in Paris, and the Australian National University. Before his PhD, he was a research fellow at the Czech Institute of International Relations in Prague and a lecturer at the university in the Czech Republic and Albania. He has written a number of books. In the long run, Future as a Political Idea, Politics of Last Resort, Governing by Emergency in the European Union, The Meaning of Partisanship, and Political Allegiance After European Integration. His work has appeared in the American Political Science Review, Journal of Politics, Political Studies, Modern Law Review, Political Theory, Journal of Common Market Studies, British Journal of Political Science, British Journal of Sociology, European Journal of International Relations, and Journal of Political Philosophy. He has also written for The Guardian, New Statesman, and Boston Review. In today's episode, we'll primarily talk about his recent popular book, In the Long Run, The Future as a Political Idea. Jonathan, it's such a pleasure to have you in my show. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Jonathan, let me begin by asking, the title of your book is very attractive. What does the title of this book suggest or means in the long run, the future as a political idea?
So I guess in the first instance, it's an allusion to a famous dictum of Keynes, the political economist from almost 100 years ago, where he, of course, made this observation that in the long run, we're all dead. So he was, I guess he was parodying a tendency in the economic crises of the 1920s, a tendency to say, look, if we're simply patient, if we allow events to play out, then ultimately, in the long run, things will be fine. Let's not try and resolve everything immediately. Let's be patient. And of course, for Keynes, this somehow captured one of the problems of a very laissez-faire approach to the market, which is that, sure, if you believe the market and capitalism works well, then in the long term, it'll be fine. Everything will even itself out. But Keynes, of course, was very interested in crisis, moments of breakdown, things when things are going wrong. And he wanted to emphasize that maybe it's not enough simply to wait indefinitely for a better future. So I chose a title that has an echo to this point, although partly because I feel that that today our anxieties are actually much more pressing than Keynes was capturing there. So I think in an age of crisis again, but also of climate change, of democratic discontent in many countries, again, I think people have that sense of breakdown, but in the sense that in the short run, things may go very badly wrong. And what I wanted to then capture with this idea of in the long run is that firstly, on the one hand, we seem to be living in a moment where people don't believe in the long run. Perhaps that kind of reassurance is hard to come by, and yet there's something maybe lost with that maybe important things require some kind of belief in the long run if they are to work properly. Democracy, the economy, and many other things. So I guess that was my general thinking with the title.
Right. And, the tortoise in the cover page as well, does that also reflect the same, what you just said?
Yeah, so I mean, another aspect to this is that I was teaching at LSE a course on the politics of the future. So a lot of this book comes out of my teaching and the discussions that we had in class and the things that students wanted to talk about. And therefore, while on the one hand it's a book that has a kind of a historical sweep to it that goes back to the 18th century, to the makings of modern Europe, at the same time I wanted to capture things that people wanted to talk about when thinking about the future today. Emergencies of different kinds, climate change, economic crisis, especially in the West, in Europe, and so on, in the 2010s, especially. So it's a book that, on the one hand, has its kind of its ideas coming out of my research, but at the same time, I wanted to capture things that seemed to be of interest to those I were teaching at the time.
Right, right. So, and how have you defined the concept of the future in the context of your book then?
So I think maybe the first thing to observe is that the future is a concept with a history. So we might be tempted to think that as long as there have been humans, there have been people thinking about something that we might call the future, some world to come, things that are to do with tomorrow and the day after and many years to come. But historians, I think, would often emphasize that no, not all societies historically have necessarily had a concept of the future. They may have thought, of course, about things that happen not right now, but have happened yesterday or may happen tomorrow. But they didn't necessarily have something that we might call the future as a kind of a realm of possibility where things could be very different from the present. And so this book takes as its point of departure an idea of the future as something that was, you could say, discovered or invented. And many historians would say, in Europe, that's something like the 18th century, perhaps a little bit before, a little bit after. But this is when, in a context of social change, in a context of revolution, think of the French Revolution, think of the American Revolution, also in Haiti, in a context where in many places things are starting to change, this is when people start to think that, maybe tomorrow is not going to be necessarily the same as today. Maybe it's not just an endless cycle of repetition that the sun goes down and the sun rises and it rises on essentially the same world, but that maybe things can change and maybe we can change them by some kind of concerted political action. So the concept of the future that this book is interested in is one where we live in awareness that things could be different, that things could be made different. And yet, of course, that maybe this belief waxes and wanes over time. Sometimes people are more convinced of that thought, perhaps especially in times of high political engagement or belief in collectives like parties or movements. When you believe that, by working with others, you can actually achieve something, maybe that belief in the future becomes stronger. Conversely, maybe in other times, and to some degree perhaps in the present, when people start to become more fatalistic about what you can actually do in politics, then maybe that belief in the future gets weaker and in turn starts to reinforce that sense of fatalism. So my idea of the future is something which has a history to it, is not always the same. It's not a universal kind of precondition of psychology or something, but it's something that changes over time and in different places.
Right, right. So, Jonathan, as I was listening to you, some of the talks that you have given prior as well on the same book, I think you somewhere suggested that we are running out of time. Are we running out of time, and how does future looks like for you?
So I think that's certainly a common feeling. I think it's also a feeling that we have to question a little bit and put in doubt. So, of course, the sensibility that says we're running out of time, I think, is present in a lot of different aspects of contemporary life. I've mentioned climate change, and of course, those who are interested in climate change, whether that's in view of climate science or in view of immediate experience in, I don't know, rising ocean levels and so on, those who live in awareness of these concerns, I think, may be very attuned to climate deadlines that talk about having a certain number of years in order to ensure that public policy takes the right path rather than the wrong path. Clearly, then, that's also, I think, magnified in geopolitics, in kind of concerns about ongoing political conflicts or imminent wider political international conflicts, and indeed to do with economic instability. So that sense that we're living in a kind of critical moment, I think you find in many different parts of the present. At the same time, I wouldn't want to immediately say that we should just accept that idea that we're running out of time, because I think it can be quite politically dangerous. That sense of running out of time can often be quite a difficult idea for democracy, or even for any kind of belief in progressive politics, that you can do something to respond to the problems of the present. If you feel that you're running out of time, I think there's a temptation, firstly, to prioritize the ends over the means. In other words, to say, let's not worry too much about participation in decision making. Let's just focus on getting things done. It can be quite an authoritarian sensibility. If you feel like you've only got 6 years to save the world, or 20 years or whatever, then there's no time for mistakes. You can't correct mistakes, and you can't correct if public opinion is wrong on a certain issue. There isn't time to correct that, so let's just act. That's the kind of logic of thinking that goes with that sense that we're running out of time. And I think, on the one hand, as I say, that's kind of politically problematic, but I think it's also misleading in terms of the problems that we face. I mean, short of an existential end to humanity or to civilization, however you want to put it, there is always kind of a further future that we have to engage with. Taking the climate change example, even if the world heats up by 2 degrees, 4 degrees, or even the more apocalyptic scenarios beyond that, there will still be political decisions that have to be taken in that hotter world. There will still be questions of how does the global north relate to the global south? How do relations of inequality within countries play out? And so that sense that we have only a very short amount of time left, I think, can blind us to the fact that we actually have to think much more long term if we are to take seriously these kind of big long term challenges. So we're running out of time. I understand the sensibility, but A, I think it's a very undemocratic sensibility, and B, I think it's a kind of misleading one. Whether you care about democracy or not, I think it's misleading in terms of how we rise to the challenges of the moment.
Yeah, I completely agree, Jonathan. In fact, this sensibility of thinking that we are running out of time is putting a lot of pressure to the functioning of the democracy itself, and how the institution is going to respond to that challenge. What's your take on that?
I think that's absolutely right. So my background is partly in theories of democracy, and one thing that occurs to me is that when we think about how democracy works as a political form, we've often, I think, relied on some idea that there is a further future which allows the system to work. So, to put this concretely, why should people accept election results that they don't agree with? Well, I think one of the classical arguments would be, maybe you didn't win the election this time, but there's another election to come. Or if not in just 4 or 5 years, then even further beyond that, there is some moment in the future where everything that is wrong with politics in the present can potentially be addressed and corrected. So representative democracy, because it's never perfect, because it can never include all interests, all values at a particular moment, it often relies on this idea that there's a future in which the problems of the present can be addressed. I think what we see today is exactly the problems that come when this idea starts to encounter difficulties, when people no longer believe in that notion that there is a longer game to play, that the problems of the present can still be corrected later on. Then, of course, why do people accept election results? Maybe they don't, as we see in countries from the US to Brazil, but also more widely, that there is exactly a kind of a reluctance, I think, to accept democracy as a process, democracy as a set of institutions and procedures, and exactly to question it when things don't go the right way as you see it at a particular moment. That can, of course, not just lead to contested elections, it can lead to disengagement. People who stop believing in that process, why would they vote? Why would they join political parties, or even sympathize with political parties or any other form of representation? If you don't really believe that there's a process there that you can engage with, it's easy to kind of to lose interest. So it's about contestation of processes, it's about declining participation. I guess it's also perhaps about a loss of the politics of big ideas, of projects, things that, think of the parties of the past. In Europe, we often had social democratic parties, socialist parties, liberal parties. If you think of the name of those parties, they all define themselves by a kind of a long-term project, an ism that stretches out into the future. And once you start to lose that conviction that there is a kind of a longer future to engage with, parties are not going to look like that anymore. They're going to be much more about personalities. They're going to be about maybe defending group interests in a particular moment, but without that sense of the longer project to which the present is meant to contribute. So, in addition to the kind of problems I mentioned about declining participation, disillusionment, I think it's also a change in the substance of politics towards personality, charisma, away from a politics of ideas, of long-term projects, and so on.
Right, right. It seems that there's been a fundamental shift in a human being itself. The human being who coined and invented the institution for the 19th century, democracy and other institutions, seems to have a paradigm shift, and to respond to the present. And to respond to the need of today's society, do you think there's a need for democracy itself to evolve?
I think there certainly is. I mean, of course, the skeptics would say that we never really achieved democracy in the first place in any part of the world, whether it's Europe, whether it's North America, whether it's East Asia, wherever you look, that the idea that we've got to protect something that exists, some people would say, no, I mean, that's far too complacent. Modern democracy has been a highly inadequate, barely existing phenomenon. So, yes, I think it certainly has to evolve or even be completed in some fashion in a way that is much more ambitious than anything that has been tried so far. Of course, then the challenging question is what can that mean in practice? I guess to some degree I've hinted at that in what I've just said in terms of a need to find new ways of doing collective politics, parties in a way that's much more focused on big ideas, projects, meaningful transformational change, rather than simply 4-year terms run by particular personalities, judged on their competence, judged on their capacity to ward off the worst, rather than to try and improve things for the better. So some of my book is about trying to think about how to develop parties and other collectives as something that is a little bit more ambitious than what we have in the present. Of course, some people would also say the problem extends to the very framework in which democracy in the present exists. It has often emerged in a national framework, closely tied to ideas of nationalism, but also in a way that's quite localized. And in the present period, clearly a lot of economic forces, but also ecological problems are much wider than the nation state itself. And so another thing then I look at in the book is the extent to which recovering that kind of faith in the future is also about trying to expand politics in space, thinking about ways of doing transnational politics, ways of forming cross-national political projects so that it's not just one nation state does one thing, another nation state does another thing, but it's exactly ways of trying to coordinate between them. Most efforts at this, of course, have been not very satisfactory. In Europe, we have the European Union, doesn't work particularly well in these terms, precisely because it tends to accentuate that sense of detachment between people and decision making, partly because it's quite a technocratic project. It's something done by elites from above. So I think if there is any promise to be had in transnational forms of politics, it's got to be much more participatory, democratic than anything that we see in the current European Union. Don't know whether the United Nations is likely to be democratized in this fashion anytime soon, but clearly these types of ways of looking for a democracy beyond the nation state, I think, are important, because this historical connection between democracy and the nation, I think, is part of the problem in the present.
Right, right. And what kind of leaders you think will be able to cope up with the future challenges? There seems to be an immense competition for leaders to become more aggressive, less democratic these days.
Yeah, I think that's exactly true. And of course, sometimes they do so by promising to take care of the future. In other words, exactly in these anxieties about the future. Think of someone like Milei in Argentina. He says, "Give me 20 years, and we'll be like Germany and like the US. We will be a country on the as part of the global north, you might say." And so this idea that if you only empower me for long enough, we'll be fine, is exactly one of those points of intersection between anxiety about the future and the authoritarian self-empowerment of individual leaders. So it's exactly in these conditions of anxiety about the future that there is a kind of new energy behind authoritarian politics. At the same time, I think there is a kind of a wider. Certainly, I mean, I come from Europe and I speak as a specialist in European politics. I think there is, at the same time, a kind of hunger for a more substantive politics, a politics of ideas rather than of personalities. And I think when you occasionally see political parties that break through and that have a much more demanding agenda, I mean, they tend to split opinion. Some people love them, some people hate them, but they tend to invigorate politics once again, and people get excited about them in Britain. I don't think that's true of the current Labour government that's just entered office, but I think it was true of the Labour Party a few years ago when they were much more ambitious in the kinds of political project that they were pursuing, exactly about climate change, exactly about economic inequality and global politics, and trying to change things on a much more profound level. So while on the one hand, I think the politics of personality, of charisma, of authoritarianism does prosper in these conditions, I think there's a lot of people that would get more interested in politics if politicians actually promised real alternatives to the status quo. If they, said how the economy works at present is not necessarily good enough for the majority of people in any particular country, perhaps even for large majorities in some countries, it just doesn't work. And we, in coordination with like-minded people in other countries, are going to try and do something about that. I think to the extent that those types of politicians emerge, they might do much better than people would currently assume. So I think there needs to be a kind of renewal of internationalism, of a politics of ambition and transformation rather than a politics of limited ambitions, managing hopes, downplaying expectations, and so on. That's what a lot of politicians of the present try to do. And I think that kind of disengagement with politics that you see in many countries is an effect of that.
Yeah. And can you please discuss any critics or challenges you encountered while developing your ideas in the long run?
Well, I think one interesting challenge that you sometimes hear, especially from Europeans, is that Europe is an aging set of societies, that people are getting older. The average age is increasing as people live longer, and therefore electorates themselves are becoming older. And, the skeptic might say, well, Jonathan, it's of course no surprise that politics is becoming more short-termist, that politics cares less about the future, because if you have voters who are more and more old people, of course they don't really care so much about the things that will happen long after they are gone. Of course they're going to focus much more on preserving the status quo or ensuring that they themselves don't get poorer, And in European countries, often the older are more economically secure than the younger. Maybe they own houses, as opposed to young people that struggle to find houses, struggle to find jobs, struggle basically to get by economically. So there's a certain line of skepticism towards me that might say, well, you emphasize what politics can do about how parties might transform themselves, but you're failing to engage with the wider social changes, which are the key factors here. Aging societies lead to short-termist politics. For me, that's a bit too determinist. I mean, you can see the logic of the point, but at the same time, old people often have grandchildren. They often are somehow invested in the further future. And in some sense, maybe more than ever, precisely because there are more grandparents who are voting in politics than ever before, you might say there are more people who have that stake in the longer future than ever before. And even if it's not about their own ties to family, I think many people have an interest in the world after they are gone, an interest precisely because they are not necessarily self-interested only, because maybe they have a more romantic sensibility. To some people, they may have a religious sensibility that makes them interested in how the world fares after their own particular lives. And politicians, I think, can actually try and draw on that. They can try and appeal exactly to those concerns that people might have with things after their own lives, and try and make that exactly something that they want to vote for, that they want to bring into politics, rather than simply acquiescing in this idea that people only care about what they themselves will live to see, and as they get older, they don't care so much about the further future of the world. So that's a kind of argument you sometimes hear. Jonathan, your focus is on politics, but what about social change? What about the ways in which societies are becoming more short-termist? I think these arguments are interesting. I think there is something to them, but at the same time, I think they're a bit too fatalistic. And I think that everyone, is a divided soul in some sense. Sure, many of us at some level want immediate gratification. We want things to be kind of better for us in the short term. But many of us also have another part of ourselves where we care about things which are not going to make our lives better, that are going to make other people's lives better and make the world better in some longer term sense. We're divided people at the individual level, and politicians can either appeal to one personality or they can appeal to the other personality. And I think, therefore, we shouldn't be too determinist about this. We shouldn't assume that aging societies necessarily means more short-termist, self-interested people in the world.
Right, right. We are exactly. I completely agree, Jonathan, that we are divided not only in two pieces, I think in many boxes, in fact.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, in that context, how can we encourage more public dialogue and awareness about the importance of long term thinking in politics?
So, a lot of people in the study of democracy might say that exactly the problem is representation as we have done it so far. That parties voting every 4 years, 5 years, that's exactly the problem. And they might say, well, voting every 5 years, maybe that was okay sometime in the past when the world didn't change so quickly, because you could hope things to be sort of predictable at the moment when you vote, sufficiently that you could expect to shape the course of events by your vote over the next electoral cycle. But as the world speeds up, in the face of ecological, economic, political changes, some people might say that's no longer good enough, that things change too quickly. You can't expect people to vote once and then leave it to leaders for the next 5 years. I think that's true. But for some people, they would say, well, the problem is parties' representation. Let's do something very different. Let's, for example, have citizen assemblies. Let's have forms of decision making where you try and leave political parties out of it, and maybe you have a random sample of ordinary people and you bring them together and you let them decide on a particular question. So a principle of representation which is more like random selection, sortition. In other words, just bringing people together randomly to decide on the future of the country. The idea being that then You can get away from vested interests. You can get away from the hold of the past, and you can allow people to think in real time as the world changes. For me, those are interesting ideas, but they're somewhat idealistic. I think still the power in society is still in existing institutions of representation, of parties, of states, of bureaucracies, and having these kinds of experiments, if you don't try to change who has power within the states and across states, then they're likely to be a little bit ornamental. So for me, the challenge is much more how do we democratize parties? How do we democratize the state and the capacity of people to influence politics in those long spaces between elections? Because I agree that once every 5 years is not good enough, but I think it's much more about how to democratize representation as we know it, rather than trying to exit those familiar forms into citizen assemblies and things which are very different. But this is a debate to be had. Maybe there are these kind of innovations which are worth pursuing, or maybe they can be part of that transnationalization of politics that I was talking about before. Maybe there are ways that you can have citizen assemblies at a transnational level to think about the kinds of wider problem that tend to be lost in national politics. So I wouldn't want to exclude those things. Clearly, there's also questions for workplace democracy, union politics, strengthening unions, strengthening the capacity of workers to have some say over what companies do, or what a civil service does, or what local government does in a particular place. So these forms of strengthening the participation of people not as citizens but as workers, as people with a job. Maybe this is another thing that one can also look at. So yeah, there are things that need to be done. Democracy as we know it is not good enough. As I say, maybe it doesn't even deserve the term democracy in many cases. But I think you have to work with the existing structures of power rather than just try to exit them.
Right, right. My last question, Jonathan, what do you hope readers will take away from your book regarding their own roles in shaping the future of politics?
I think one thing which strikes me about how many societies think about the future today is that they often turn it into a matter of expertise, that forecasting is something for experts, that that maybe the experts can tell us what GDP will look like in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, or that military forecasters have a better understanding of international geopolitics than the ordinary person because they have particular ways of making forecasts, they have inside knowledge, and so on. Or indeed, in the case of climate change, that we should treat it as a problem for experts to think about because they have all the economic models, the environmental models, the climate models, basically that the future is a matter of expertise. And I think this is misleading. I think that view is often based on a kind of overestimation of the predictability of the future for experts. And I think often is associated with trying to predict the future rather than trying to imagine how the future could be different and trying to act politically to shape it in those terms. So we need, I think, much more focus on a kind of politics of imagination rather than a politics of calculation and expertise. And I guess that's one thing that I might hope that my book encourages people to think about, to show the limits of conceiving the future as a matter for expert judgment, the limits of approaching the future as a problem of simple prediction, where most of us simply sit it out and wait and see what happens and let the experts try and see what's coming. I think my book is trying to remind people that no, that the future is not just about prediction, it's not just about expertise. In fact, precisely because the future is pretty unpredictable, we're kind of all equal before it. There's a kind of egalitarian thought to that. There aren't the experts and the idiots when it comes to the future. We're all at some level idiots, and we all have to try and work out how we're going to try and shape that future together. So that, I think, is one of the messages that I want the book to convey. There's something democratic. There should be something democratic about the future, precisely because no one can really claim the authority to see what's coming. even though in present societies, many people try to make that claim. And I think that's a problem.
On that note, Jonathan, your particularly last sentence that no one has an authority to what's coming. On that note, I take an opportunity to thank you once again for your time, and I wish that your book is read and debated in many other platforms as well. Jonathan, thank you once again for your time.
Thanks very much for having me on the program.